Israeli airstrikes hammered the city of Beirut today, striking multiple targets in the Lebanese capital. It was a ferocious Israeli assault following a weekend barrage of Hezbollah rockets, the violent precursor to a long-awaited ceasefire deal. Tonight, Israel is on the way to approving a US-backed plan to halt the fighting, a new window of opportunity for stability and security. But is Israel or Hezbollah ready for peace? I'm Anya Coopers-McKinnon, and this is The Day.
The conflict between Israel and Iran-backed Hezbollah is at a critical moment.
The only way to end the suffering of people on all sides is a permanent and immediate ceasefire.
That's the single most important thing to make an immediate difference, to stop the rockets and missiles from flying.
If Hezbollah violates the agreement and tries to rearm, we will strike.
It will make a big difference in saving lives and livelihoods in Lebanon and in Israel.
If they try to renew terror activities, we will strike.
We begin with news that Israel's Security Cabinet has agreed to a ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made the announcement after discussing a plan drawn up by the United States and France and backed by the EU. In his statement, Netanyahu maintained a tough tone, insisting Israel will retaliate if Hezbollah violates the truce.
This evening, the Cabinet will approve a framework for a ceasefire in Lebanon. The duration of a ceasefire depends on what unfolds in Lebanon. In full coordination with the United States, we are maintaining complete military freedom of action. If Hezbollah violates the agreement and tries to rearm, we will strike. If they try to renew terror activities near the border, we will strike. If they launch a rocket, dig a tunnel, or bring in a truck with missiles, we will strike.
Netanyahu said he was agreeing to the ceasefire now to replenish weapons supplies and to rest Israeli troops. He also said it gave Israel time to intensify pressure on Hamas and, quote, focus on the Iranian threat. DW's Jerusalem correspondent Tanya Kremer has some initial reactions to tonight's developments.
Well, I think people here are trying now to understand, all the details, what this entails. So the reactions are still coming in. We had a first reaction here from the opposition leader, Yair Lapid, who basically said, that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu brought the greatest disaster on Israel, but no agreement with Hezbollah will change that. And he also talked that there's a need now to bring the hostages that remain in Gaza home. But I think in general there is some cautious optimism on the one hand, but we also heard in the lead up to this some criticism also from some of the community leaders and mayors from the northern communities. They're very much concerned that Hezbollah could use, this time of 60 days or the coming weeks and months to rearm and regroup as well. They want to have and they want to see more guarantees to ensure that this ceasefire will hold and Hezbollah will not come back to the border area.
That was DW's Tanya Kremer there. Now, Lebanon's Prime Minister, Najib Mikati, is demanding an immediate implementation of the ceasefire. Earlier today, the Israeli military launched a barrage of strikes against what it said were Hezbollah targets in southern Beirut. Israel's military says it struck 20 targets in just 120 seconds. At least 7 people were reported killed, dozens were wounded. For the first time, Israel also issued evacuation warnings for the centre of Beirut. Natasha Hall is a senior fellow with the Middle East programme at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, and she's joining us now from Washington, D.C. Welcome to DW. Thank you for your time. Benjamin Netanyahu just gave a defiant speech. Do you think that Israel is truly interested in ending this war?
I think few wars truly end these days, including potentially this one. This is obviously a 60-day pause in hostilities in the hopes that it will lead to a lasting ceasefire, and no information on a peace agreement between the warring parties at all. The other thing to note here is that 60 days takes us into the new U.S. administration, the President Trump administration. So one could see a potential for a widening war when that comes. But for now, the hope is that at least this gives a break in hostilities.
Speaking of the US, what has Washington had to do to get this deal on the table?
That's a great question. We've seen a flurry of diplomacy for weeks, if not months now. Amos Hochstein recently in the region in the hopes that he could secure actually a ceasefire deal during his trip. But we're seeing that play out right now. I'm guessing there was a lot of promises to Israel in terms of defense, as has always been the case, and continued sort of protection of Israel, arms deliveries, et cetera, in order for Israel to be able to withstand any kind of attacks in the next 60 days, if not more. The other aspect of this ceasefire that had been an issue was whether or not Israel would be able to attack once again if it felt like the ceasefire had been broken. And it wasn't entirely clear what the terms of that would be, but it seems like the U.S. is on board for anything that it needs to deliver, at least in the next 60 days.
Israel set out to disrupt, to weaken Hezbollah as a political and military force. Does a ceasefire deal mean that they have succeeded in that? I mean, what state is Hezbollah in right now?
Well, I think the biggest win for Israel was actually detaching the ceasefire in Lebanon with the ceasefire in Gaza. We've seen a ramp up in the offensive on Gaza, while we've seen the ceasefire with Lebanon. And undoubtedly, we've seen a decapitation of leadership and the rank and file within Hezbollah, Hamas, and other like-minded groups in recent months. So undoubtedly, this is a group that has been terribly weakened. That said, I think with all of these sort of asymmetric groups, they tend to not want to engage in war with Israel or the United States head on. They would like to do it through asymmetric warfare. So it's entirely possible that Hezbollah hunkers down and regroups and recuperates for the next conflict.
UN Resolution 1701 ended the last major war between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006. Nearly 20 years later, is it still the right framework to build a new ceasefire around? Because it didn't work out last time, did it?
No, it certainly did not. What we've seen in this ceasefire arrangement is that Hezbollah will withdraw south of the Litani River, and that hundreds, if not thousands, of Lebanese armed forces will essentially take their place alongside UNIFIL forces in the south to ensure that mandate is actually fulfilled. The issue is that Hezbollah, while weakened, is a much stronger component of the Lebanese political landscape today than it was. And so it kind of remains to be seen if Lebanese politicians would be able to really seriously detach themselves from Hezbollah. There is a danger in that. We've seen a lot of political assassinations in the past linked to Syria and Hezbollah. So I think that it would be very challenging to completely eliminate Hezbollah influence from the country altogether.
There is supposed to be an international committee overseeing the ceasefire. Who's going to be on that committee? And could that be a sticking point in all of this?
Well, that has been a sticking point. Israel has disagreed with France being on that committee. The Palestinians have disagreed with Britain being on that committee, but it also seems like they've dropped their disagreements. So it's unclear if that will continue to be a sticking point. But I'm sure that will be an avenue for any kind of issues that come up, that will inevitably come up in the next few months to at least have some kind of multilateral effort to resolve those issues. And amongst those issues is the billions of dollars worth of damage that's been done in Lebanon. France is going to have to be a part of that solution, and many others as well.
Netanyahu is saying that Israel will now focus on the Iranian threat. What do you think he has in mind when he says that?
I think that this leaves the door open for Israel to continue to pursue its war by any means necessary. So whether that's through Hezbollah, Hamas, other proxies in Iraq and Syria, or directly with Iran, I think that his rhetoric essentially just leaves the door open for his political opponents and his allies like Benny Gantz, who have opposed this ceasefire in the past, to be able to continue to sort of knock out any kind of Iranian assets for the foreseeable future.
Israel and Hezbollah have agreed to a 60-day ceasefire to end the fighting in Lebanon. People across southern Lebanon celebrated news of the deal, which comes into effect at 4 a.m. local time on Wednesday. Under the agreement, Israeli and Hezbollah troops are to gradually withdraw from southern Lebanon to be replaced by the Lebanese army. Hezbollah and Israel have continued to exchange rocket fire as the deadline approaches. Now, if the truce holds, it'll bring an end to over a year of violence between the two parties. And the United States and France were key parties in brokering the deal. U.S. President Joe Biden praised the agreement as a critical step towards a broader peace deal in the conflict, which began with the Hamas terror attacks on Israel in October last year.
Israel has been bold on the battlefield. Iran and its proxies have paid a very heavy price. Now Israel must be bold in turning tactical gains against Iran and its proxies into a coherent strategy that secure Israel's long-term safety and advances a broader peace and prosperity in the region. Today's announcement is a critical step in advancing that vision. And so I applaud the crazy decision made by the leaders of Lebanon and Israel to end the violence. It reminds us that peace is possible.
I asked DW's correspondent in Washington, D.C., Benjamin Alvarez Gruber, what pressure the U.S. brought to bear on both sides to agree the ceasefire.
These were ongoing negotiations for many months, including the US, France, Lebanon, Israel. And the big question now that many are having is how will this be enforced and what will happen over the next couple of days? Following these remarks, there was a joint press statement from President Biden and also from French President Macron, saying that both nations are committed on working with both Israel and Lebanon to ensure that this agreement is fully implemented and enforced. And we also heard more details from a high-ranking US official that says that France will join in an already existing mechanism that was created after the war in 2006. And there will be both diplomatic and military channels. And through them, the US will work with the Lebanese army. And this administration official also said that there will be resources allocated to support the reconstruction of Lebanon, because in the past, and that's also one of the learnings that they said, is that it was often Hezbollah that helped with reconstruction, and now it's not only in Lebanon's interest to support the economic growth and seeing this as an opportunity to reestablish power in the territory. And also what's important, that's something that we've heard over and over here from Washington, is that there won't be US combat troops in the area, but there will be support crews to help also enforce the ceasefire deal.
Joining us now is Stephen A. Cook, a senior fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Good to have you with us, Stephen. Now, we've seen an intensified wave of strikes in the final hours before this ceasefire comes into effect. Do you expect the ceasefire to hold?
Well, if we go by the history of ceasefires in the region of late, no. I think the real question is how the United States will manage this mechanism, as it's being called, to enforce the ceasefire. One, how will the mechanism compel Hezbollah to withdraw beyond the Litani River, which is about 18 miles north of the Israeli border, and what the United States and France will do when it comes to the question of violations. Will they agree with Israel that something is a violation, or the Lebanese government that something isn't a violation? And what will be the consequences of those of a given violation? So these are details that no one knows the answer to. I don't even believe that U.S. officials know the answer to these questions. And it is clear that Hezbollah will test this mechanism as soon as it can.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of Hezbollah, they had said they would continue their attacks until Israel stopped its operations in Gaza. Now we're seeing this ceasefire. Is this some kind of admission of defeat on their part?
Absolutely. It demonstrates that Hezbollah's words were empty, and that it could not, under withering Israeli fire, particularly since September, continue to fight and support Hamas from afar. Now, of course, Hezbollah never did as much as the Hamas leadership had wanted it to do and believed it would do. But nevertheless, the continuous rocket fire in Israel was a significant security challenge for Israel, such that it had to evacuate close to 80,000 of its own residents. But now, after the Israeli withering assault on Hezbollah, they really can't manage to be the same kind of security threat in support of Hamas. Hamas now stands alone, and it's a critical moment. They can either decide to go for a ceasefire or continue to face Israeli military operations.
On that note, what implications do you think this might have overall when we look towards the conflict in Gaza?
Well, like I said, the Hamas leadership needs to make a decision now. Clearly, Iran has approved a ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel. And that means that the kind of support that Hamas has continuously looked for from its patrons in Tehran and Beirut is not forthcoming. And after all of these months of war and all the damage that has been done to Gaza, the Hezbollah leadership, the Hamas leadership, really needs to decide whether it wants to continue fighting and continue the suffering in the Gaza Strip, or whether it will sue for a ceasefire.
I'm just wondering about, as you mentioned, Iran, for example, what leverage they'll be able to have, because now we've seen a ceasefire with Hezbollah, but it's a whole different ballgame if we were to have one with Hamas. I'm just wondering what role they would be able to play in this.
Well, the Iranian leadership would like to fight to the last Palestinian and to the last Lebanese. The very fact that the Israelis have destroyed much of Iran's air defense system and leaves the Iranians vulnerable to further Israeli attack would suggest that the Iranians have very little leverage left, nor do they have much of an interest in a ceasefire. I think that the entire Iranian strategy of sowing chaos in and around the region, but particularly on Israel's borders, have, after these 15 months, failed. Of course, Israel has faced its own setbacks in terms of its international legitimacy and the discourse in Western countries and the willingness of Arab countries to contemplate normalization with Israel as a result. But overall, Israel's strategic position is much better than it was even on October 6th, 2023. Hamas has been greatly degraded. Hezbollah is back on its heels, and Iran is vulnerable to the Israelis. I don't believe, getting back directly to your question, that the Iranians really have much leverage left in this situation.
OK, we'll leave it there. Stephen A. Cook from the Council on Foreign Relations, we appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.